Hello, everybody. Welcome to our fourth chapter in Unit 1. Remember, we're still in Unit 1, even though the stuff we're going to talk about today is College Boards Unit 2 and a teensy teeny little bit of Unit 3 as well. Just like with the other videos, remember that these videos are going to be around 20-ish minutes. There'll be a little bit of a preamble, a little bit of a ramble at the end as well. I thought it was funny. We'll talk about some of the economic and political relationships with England and its North American colonies. Again, excuse me, this is an overview of some of the big ideas, not a complete summary of every single thing, but I am going to emphasize some of the terms and some of the concepts you would need to know from this section, this portion of Unit 1. All right. Now let's go ahead and get started. Remember, I'm going to set a timer on my phone, and I'm going to try and beat that timer, basically. All right. Three, two, one, and go. All right. Oh, shoot, 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 shoot. Stop the presses, stop the clock. I can't start yet because these are the lesson topics right here. So, in terms of coordination with the AP, with the College Board, with online resources that exist, this is what we're going to talk about really today. We're going to talk about transatlantic trade. We're going to talk a little bit about culture, and mostly we will talk about this last point right here, kind of setting up the context for the American Revolution, which we will begin by the end of next chapter. All right. So let's go ahead and take a look now. Now I can begin timing myself. And before I do, and go. Here we go. So, to kind of understand the economic relationship between England and its colonies, we're going to take a look first at a kind of four-step model of how to describe the relationship between England and its North American colonies. And we call this, or some historians call this, the stages of empire. Now, let's focus on this first stage right here, the so-called era of benign abandonment. Now, this is going to actually help describe a little bit about what the first earliest interactions between the colonies and the North America, or between the colonies in North America and England are going to look like. We see that initially in the early years of English colonization, that there's not a lot of direct British presence in their North American colonies. These North American colonies are largely self-governing. We saw that with the example of the House of Burgesses in Virginia. We see that with the example of the General Court in Massachusetts. But all of the rest of the colonies, all rest of the 11 of them, they also have similar local structures. They are not governed directly by the government of England. There may be a royal governor who's technically there to put a British face on everything, but for the most part, they are going to be locally self-governed colonies in the New Worlds. And this is going to set up a precedent. It sets up a precedent, a tradition, if you will, of the American colonists honestly not having a lot of supervision by England. England is technically in charge, and no one's calling for independence, but they enjoy a lot of freedoms by living in North America. One of those freedoms being, in addition to kind of local self-government, is going to be the idea of no direct taxes to the English. We oftentimes see that merchants selling their goods in England, sometimes they pay a tax, but honestly, it's not, the price is worth it, basically. There kind of is this feeling of very few direct taxes actually imposed on the colonies. The colonies have self-independence, they have no representation in parliament, but it kind of makes up for the fact that they have local government. They have local government. They don't really need parliament representation. So there is this precedent, a tradition again being set that the colonies are self-governing economically and politically. However, we also start to see that there's a little bit of separation actually going on in terms of the ethnic makeup, the cultural makeup of British North America. Especially as time goes on, British North America is going to become much more regionally diverse in terms of who is living in the colonies. Eventually, we see large immigration of Germans, we see immigration of Scots-Irish people, see immigration of French and Dutch people, all of these different European nationalities have a cultural presence in North America. And the reason why this is important is that these cultures will kind of meld together. There is a sort of melting pot effect that does create a separate non-British identity in the Americas, one that's only fueled by ideas like the Enlightenment and the First Great Awakening. Now, despite the fact that there is this feeling of cultural separation, despite the fact that there's this feeling of political independence, we do see what ties these two places, England and its colonies, is trading systems, namely with things like the triangle trade, which you can see in this infographic right here, aka in the real world known as a map. Now, the triangle trade is this complex system that involves raw materials from the Americas being given or being sold into Britain, who is then going to make these into manufactured products to sell to Africa, but also to sell to the colonies themselves. Kind of remember, as we're going to see, North American colonies don't have a lot of manufacturing, and we'll take a look at why that is in a second. But of course, as we've mentioned in the previous chapter, in part one of chapter two, a large part of this triangle trade is the obvious use of Atlantic slaves, of West African slaves who are transported across the Atlantic Ocean to destinations in the Americas, namely the Caribbean. But of course, as we saw in our previous chapter set, that there's also slavery in the other colonies as well. So initially, it's kind of a hands-off approach. That's the government's relationship, the government of England's relationship with its colonies in the New Worlds. But as time goes on, the English government reconsiders this relationship. This leads us to the so-called era of militarism. During this period of British history, Britain is at war with a lot of its European rivals, namely groups like the Dutch, for example. Now, in order to pay for these wars, you need money. And kind of in order to sustain an overseas empire and a vast military, both on land and on sea, you got to bring in more revenue to the government. You can either tax the people in England, or you can begin enforcing an economic system to maximize the profits of the colonies. Now, in order to do this, this is where we see the adoption of what is called mercantilism. Now, mercantilism as an economic system essentially is laws and regulations that restrict who the colonies can trade with. The colonies are not allowed to produce manufactured products. They are only permitted to buy from places like England. They're only permitted to purchase manufactured goods made by the English themselves. We also see that under mercantilism that there is this idea of making a closed loop connection between the mother country, in our case, England, and the colonies. Now, in order to enforce mercantilism, we see that the English government will pass a series of laws collectively known as the Navigation Acts. Now, the Navigation Acts do a lot of things, but one of the big things that it does is that it not only creates a system of customs and inspection of goods coming in and out of the colonies, but it also includes some newfound taxes on merchants themselves. Merchants are suddenly going to have to pay import fees and export fees. These taxes are only really limited to the merchant class, but as merchants need to pay for them, they're going to up their prices. And that's especially bad, as we're going to see, because there is going to be some problems related to debt between the colonies and the mother country. There's taxes on merchants. There's restrictions on what can be traded. Raw materials from the Americas go to Europe. Manufactured goods from Europe go to the Americas. Now, actually, there's a little bit of a kind of dissatisfaction and problem of debt, actually, between the colonies and England. And you can see why this debt system emerges based on this infographic right here. The colonies produce valuable commodities, valuable raw materials. The problem is that compared to manufactured goods, these are of lower price. So kind of a big effect of mercantilism and the Navigation Act specifically is going to be the development of a lot of debt burden on the colonies to England itself. However, there are other problems with the Navigation Acts. For one thing, in order to enforce inspections, in order to enforce tax collection, in order to enforce all of these things, you need to have a lot of money. However, kind of England is kind of broke. They're going to say, fine, or well, as we're going to see, they're going to eventually say, we don't have enough money to sustain this project. We might have to reconsider the policies of the Navigation Acts. There's a big tax burden, not just on the colonists, on the merchant colonists, but also on English citizens as well. In order to pay for the overseas empire, taxes are going to go up on British subjects in England, and we see those taxes on the merchants in the colonies. But in general, we do see a lot of dissatisfaction. We see open riots in the streets. We see that some businesses that were forced to close because of bankruptcy, they're going to be kind of powder kegs of the political agitation in places like Boston, where trade was oftentimes pretty common. So, kind of because of the difficulty of the Navigation Acts to actually enforce, this leads us to our third phase of empire, the era of salutary neglect. Now, salutary neglect is a specific sort of a-push term that has to do with the period between the sort of soft repeal of the Navigation Acts, as we will see with the figure of Robert Walpole, but also the start and end of the French and Indian War. Now, Robert Walpole, the guy in the glasses right there, he was the Prime Minister of England, and he is actually going to introduce this program of salutary neglect. But what does salutary neglect mean? In recognizing that the cost is outweighing the benefits, in recognizing as well that there's a lot of dissatisfaction, both within the overtaxed English citizens and the colonists themselves, we begin to see that Robert Walpole is going to say, fine, it's too expensive. We are still going to have the Navigation Acts on the books. They are the official law of the land regarding the colonies in England. That being said, we are not going to enforce them strictly. That's what costs money. That's what makes it difficult to sustain your overseas empires, the cost of administration. So Robert Walpole is going to actually ease these restrictions. That's kind of the big deal with salutary neglect. Now, the reason why this period is important is that it reinforces that feeling that emerged in the era of benign abandonment, that we are a group of people who are separate. We have a local economic and political autonomy to do what we want. And we do see that kind of when Robert Walpole relaxes the Navigation Acts, it makes the colonists kind of think, we got them to do what we wanted them to do. Turns out protests and mass dissatisfaction, they actually get something done. If we don't like a law, we can protest it. Keep that pinned in the back of your mind. Now, the period of salutary neglect is going to unfortunately come to a close by the 1700s, especially by the 1750s and 1760s, leading us to the fourth stage of empire, the so-called era of empire, the age of empires, if you will, to Book of Secrets. No. All right. So, in the kind of 1740s, in the 1750s, in the 1760s, England is back at it again with rivals and wars with its enemies, namely the French, the Spanish, and to a degree, the Dutch as well. And kind of in order to pay for these wars, that's what England is going to have to reconsider how it does that. And we'll take a look at some of the discussions about that later. However, kind of the most important conflict in this age of empire, the biggest one, the one that really sets the stage for what becomes the American Revolution, is the so-called 7 Years' War, aka the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War is the North American name for this very European conflict. Now, kind of partially what causes the 7 Years' War is competition over territory in Africa, Europe, and Asia, and in the Americas as well. Now, this is going to predominantly be expressed in the colonial competition between the French and the English. The English and the French historically are enemies of each other. And in terms of competing for land, they oftentimes did, especially over here in kind of the Mississippi, Ohio River Valley area. Now, kind of even though the North American theater of the Seven Years' War is not the primary focus of that war, it is really important for our purposes. It's important because of a couple of reasons. For one thing, during the Seven Years' War, some of the colonies were concerned about attack by the French and their Native American allies. So, what we see actually is a proposal to create a pan intercolonial government that pools its resources together to raise a common militia, a common military against the evil and perfidious French. So, in 1754, this guy named Benjamin Franklin proposes what is known as the Albany Plan of Union. And like I said, it's a proposed plan to combine the militias, the governments of the colonies, not to declare independence, but to mutually defend each of the 13 colonies. Now, this is not going to happen. It is proposed, but never is actually adopted. And you do need to know why. Because even though these 13 colonies are starting to build some shared cultural identity with the form of the First Great Awakening, even though they have a common enemy in the French and Native American groups that ally with the French, we do see that individual colonies reject the Albany Plan of Union. They do not, oh, there's the boy, there's the man. Oh, you're so stinky. Yes, you are. You're a baby. Yes, you are. Good baby boy. Yes. Anyway, Albany Plan of Union fails because of these colonists that have a tradition of local independence from each other. So the local colonies kind of individually reject the Albany Plan of Union because of the strength of local regional identity. Keep this pinned in the back of your mind for Unit 2 and beyond in first semester. Now, eventually, the British win. The British win simply because of one word: boats. Their superior navy is what helps whoop the French in North America, India, and in continental Europe as well. However, even though the war ends in 1763 with the so-called Treaty of Paris, we do see that, well, Britain does win a lot with the Treaty of Paris, but also loses a lot. In terms of what it wins, look at the map right here. These purple areas are newly acquired lands that now belong to the British Empire. The problem is, even though France has kicked the heck out of the New World, except for Haiti, aka Saint Domingue at the time, we see that the English, well, now they have all this land. And yet, in order to pay for the war, in order to pay for this newfound empire, we do see that, well, the British are going to have to reconsider the policy of salutary neglect. Maybe in order to pay for the empire we acquired, in order to make up for lost money we got indebted to banks and other countries during the 7 Years' War, maybe we got to actually tax the colonies. All right. So all of this is going to lead us to the end, actually, of this chapter of AP US History, Unit 1. So kind of what we took a look at today was the evolving economic and political relationship between these two places, England and its colonies in North America. First, it kind of was this stage of benign abandonment, letting you do as you please. Then it develops into this idea of militarism. Sorry, there was a gnat right there. Militarism, in which, in order to pay for overseas conflict, we see the adoption of mercantilist policies, such as the Navigation Acts, which had the effect of driving the colonies into debt by forcing them to buy high-priced manufactured goods, discouraging local manufacturing, and also providing some taxes on customs inspection and leaving various ports of harbor. However, we saw that that policy was too expensive. It led us to salutary neglect, where the policies of mercantilism are not strictly enforced. However, when England gets back at war with places like France in the 7 Years' War, that causes a change in that salutary neglect. We're actually going to start enforcing the Navigation Acts after the French and Indian War. And that is going to be a slap in the face of the colonists who believe it is their traditional right to local independence and no taxation without representation. All right. Beautiful. Excellent. Thank you guys so much. Have a blessed, wonderful day. Let's go ahead and pause that thing. All right. Thank you so much. Bye bye. And